to those of you in the East Coast, and good morning to those of you in the Central Time Zone. It's a pleasure to have you all with us for this special lecture featuring Professor Bedross Der Matossian. Before we begin, I want to first thank the co-sponsors for this event, the Michigan State Department of Political Science, the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, Global Studies in the Arts and Humanities, the Asian Studies Center, and James Madison College. I also want to give a special thank you to Professor Tamar Boyadjian of the Department of English, who proposed this event, and our guest speaker, and we're glad that she proposed this event. Also, I want to thank Mary Ferdowsi, the administrative lead of the Muslim Studies program, for arranging for this webinar. Now, this is a webinar, it's not a standard Zoom meeting, and the reason is to avoid Zoom bombing, which has happened in the past. What's going to happen is our guest speaker will speak, and then we'll have time for questions. You may type in your questions in the Q&A. I'm on a laptop. When I move my cursor, I see the Q&A at the bottom. You may see it as well. If you're on a phone, you may need to move around a little bit and do some searching to find the Q&A, but you may type in your question. If you would prefer to ask your question by video, then you may just put in a request in the Q&A, and we can promote you to panelist to ask your question by video. So with that, let me go ahead and get started. And yes, this event will be recorded for those of you wondering. Okay, so I'm delighted. First of all, let me introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Bedross Der Matossian is the Vice Chair and Associate Professor of Modern Middle East History in the Department of History at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Born and raised in Jerusalem, he is a graduate of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he began his graduate studies in the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies. He completed his PhD in Middle East History in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University in 2008. From 2008 to 2010, he was a lecturer of Middle East History in the Faculty of History at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. He has been appointed as the Dumanian Visiting Professor in the University of Chicago for spring 2014. He is the author and co-editor of multiple books, including the award-winning book, Shattered Dreams of Revolution, From Liberty to Violence in the Late Ottoman Empire, published by Stanford University Press, and the Routledge Handbook of Jerusalem. He is the president of the Society for Armenian Studies, and the title for this presentation is Armenians of Palestine, Israel. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Bedross Der Matossian.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Thank you, Mary and Tamar Boyadjian, for inviting me to this talk. I'm going to share my screen because it's a PowerPoint presentation. Let me go here for a second. So, Armenians of Palestine, Israel in the modern period, the rise and the decline of a community. This is, by the way, the image is the main courtyard of St. James Cathedral, where I spent numerous period of my life playing as a kid in this place. So I'm going to briefly discuss the breakdown of today's lecture. First of all, I'll introduce the topic. Second, I'll discuss the historical background, followed by the mandate period, the British mandate period, and then discuss the refugee influx into Palestine, life under the mandate, British mandate, move on to the Jordanian period, followed by the Israeli rule, and finally discussing the Armenian Catholic community of Jerusalem, and the last section discussing about Armenian migration to Israel after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the Armenians of Palestine, Israel in the modern period has been a marginalized topic in Palestinian and Israeli historiography. This stems partly from language constraints, as most of the relevant material is in Armenian. But the period represents challenges even for Armenian scholars because of the inaccessibility of the Armenian patriarchal archives and the absence of local Armenian daily or even weekly newspapers in the period under study. Other factors pertain to the community's small size and its relative marginalization with regard to great political issues that absorbed Palestine and Israel during the 20th century. My lecture today addresses the Armenian presence in Palestine and Israel as a whole in the 20th century. It focuses especially on Jerusalem, which not only was and is the nucleus of the Armenian communities in Palestine and Israel, but throughout the centuries also was a major spiritual center and principal pilgrimage site for the Armenians worldwide. During the British Mandate period, the dominant ethno-religious cultural role of the Holy City and the Patriarchate of St. James actually increased as a result of the greatly diminished role of the Patriarchate of Istanbul after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and the inaccessibility of the great theological center in Echmiadzin in Armenia, which is a center of Armenian church today, following the Soviet takeover in 1920. So the Armenian presence in Palestine dates back to the 4th century AD, when Armenian pilgrims began arriving in Jerusalem after the uncovering of the holy places of Christianity ascribed to Saint Helena, mother of the newly converted Emperor Constantine I. A proliferation of monasteries, many of them Armenians, soon grew up in the Holy Land. The Armenian Apostolic Church, also known as the Armenian Gregorian Church, had its own bishop as of the 7th century. The Patriarchate of Jerusalem, in its present form, came into being in the first decade of the 14th century. Eventually, the Jerusalem Patriarchate exercised its authority over Armenians in Palestine, southern Syria, Lebanon, Cyprus, and Egypt through the Mandate times. Through the Mandate times, its jurisdiction was limited to Palestine and Transjordan. An indication of Armenia's church's importance in Jerusalem is its joint guardianship, shared with the far larger and more powerful Greek Orthodox and Latin Roman Catholic churches of Christianity's holiest sites, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, among others. During the Ottoman period, the Armenian Patriarchate of Jerusalem had to cede its administrative autonomy to the newer Armenian Patriarch of Istanbul, which was established in the 14th century, 15th century, and recognized by Ottoman state as the center of Armenian Gregorian Church throughout the empire. However, because the subordination did not involve recognition of higher religious authority, the Jerusalem Patriarchate adapted to the new situation. In fact, it may actually have benefited insofar as it received financial assistance from the Patriarchate of Istanbul, as well as support of the wealthy Amira class in its struggle to preserve its right in the holy places. In addition to the clergy within the Patriarchate, for centuries there had been a small Armenian lay community clustered around the monastery and cathedral of St. James in what became to be known as the Armenian Quarter, which occupies today about 1/6 of Jerusalem's old city. A subtle divide existed between the brotherhood, the clergy, and the lay community, owing not only to the distance that normally separates rulers from the ruled, but also the fact that the lay community was continuous, whereas the brotherhood came mainly from outside, sent to Jerusalem from theological schools and centers throughout the world. And this is an image from 1898, during the Ottoman period, taken from an article by Boris Ajemian and Talin Sujan. It's from the AGBU, Armenian General Benevolent Union Archives in Paris. It's the Easter in Jerusalem in 1898. As you can see, there are many lay communities. This is the lay community actually standing for a picture. Some Armenians remained and found employment within the larger patriarchate administration that ran the quarter and the church properties. The population of the Armenian quarter belonged to the Armenian Gregorian Church, as did the majority of Armenians throughout Palestine and the worldwide. But a small Armenian Catholic community also existed in Jerusalem as of the mid-19th century. The Catholic community was concentrated in the Muslim quarter of the Old City, where I grew up, its particular vicariate being located on Via Dolorosa. I grew up on the Via Dolorosa between the stations, 4th and 5th stations. Jerusalem's Armenians saw themselves as part of the Ottoman Palestinian society. Their first language was Arabic, though they also spoke Armenian and frequently European languages as well. The Armenians were involved in the commercial life and civil administration in the late Ottoman times. They were employed as barbers, blacksmiths, carpenters, builders, shoemakers, goldsmiths, tailors, and bankers, among other trades. They also played a political role well beyond the confines of their communities. Many of them worked in the foreign consulates in Jerusalem as translators, as dragomans, but they also were employed in the municipality of Jerusalem. The end of the Ottoman Empire and the coming of the British rule profoundly changed the nature of the Armenian community in Palestine. The sudden influx of 1915 onward of thousands of Armenian refugees fleeing the Armenian genocide radically transferred its demographic composition, even as provisions of the mandate itself affected its position among the communities of Palestine. By the way, this is the inner section of the St. James Church, one of the most beautiful churches around the Armenian churches around the globe. There are sections in it that goes back to the 4th century. The mandate preserved the privileges and the immunities that the Christian communities had enjoyed under the Ottomans. It also adopted the millet system, but with modification that undermined the notion of a political community made up of equal citizens bound together by Ottomanism that the Ottomans had tried to promote after the Tanzimat reform. The British were further aware, as the Ottomans had been, that it was easier to deal with religious hierarchies and consequently vested full interest in them as the main representatives of Palestine's religious groups. The ecclesiastic orders, which for a number of Christian sects were not part of the indigenous community, but came from the outside, naturally tended toward accommodation with the ruling British authorities. As a result, the local people were denied national representation in the governance of their communities. British policy had particular consequences for the Armenians. The coalescence of politics in Palestine along Arab, Muslim plus Christian versus Jewish lines in reaction to the mandate priorities left them marginalized. By virtue of not being Arab, they stood apart from the dominant issues of the day. But here too, there was a circumstantial factor. Given the degree of integration into Palestinian Arab society of the original Armenian community, the situation would have been different had the community not been overwhelmed by the arrival of thousands of refugees. With the refugees soon constituting the majority of the primary political involvement of the community became intra-Armenian diasporic affairs, especially since traditional Armenian political parties previously absent in Palestine but widespread elsewhere, the Dashnak and the Ramgavars were soon firmly implanted, and the divide between them heightened by the Cold War following the Soviet domination of Eastern Armenia as of 1920. While the indigenous Armenians never became involved in these issues and their sympathies were solidly with the Palestinians, their preoccupations were henceforth elsewhere. As a result of the new division, the Armenians could not even form a unified national representation in matters pertaining to the Patriarchate. The refugees, grateful to the Patriarchate for its huge role in resettlement and relief, would never challenge its authority, while the original community had long aspired to a greater saying in the patriarchal affairs, did not have any ability to interfere. The Armenian community's disengagement from local Palestinian politics was in contrast to the Arab Orthodox community, which played a dominant role in both macro and micro political developments of Palestinians. And many of the Arab Orthodox leadership played an important role within the Palestinian nationalism. I'm going to discuss about the influx of the refugees. And this is an image again taken in 1918, the second caravan of refugees from Salt in Jordan, arriving to Jerusalem from the AGBU Nubar Library archives in Paris. Very rare picture used by Ajemian and Sujian. The Armenian population of Palestine on the eve of World War I numbered between 2,000 to 3,000 persons. The majority lived in Jerusalem, with smaller communities in Haifa, Jaffa, and Ramleh and Bethlehem. As noted earlier, Palestine's indigenous Armenian population had been overwhelmed during the war by huge waves from Cilicia, the ancient Armenian kingdom in what is southwestern Turkey. By 1920, some 2,000 Armenian refugees had arrived to Jerusalem from mostly Cilicia. Most of the refugees arriving in Jerusalem and elsewhere in Palestine viewed their situation as temporary. Even my grandfather, who arrived from Cilicia, and were waiting to return back to their hometowns in Cilicia. But in 1922, Mustafa Kemal Pasha launched an offensive in Cilicia, and several shiploads of Armenians refugees arrived in Haifa. By 1925, there were 15,000 Armenians in Palestine, mainly in Jerusalem, with smaller numbers in Haifa and Jaffa. And this is the map, as you can see, map of Palestine. Back then, today, Israel / Palestine. This small, the red dots, the blue circles show the presence of Armenians in Palestine. The largest is in Jerusalem, followed by Haifa, Jaffa, Hebron, Gaza, Ramallah, Nazareth, Tiberias, and even Akko. Even after the major refugee waves ended, the Armenian community was not demographically stable. It continued to grow during the 1930s and 40s during the Armenian immigration to Palestine, especially Jerusalem, Haifa, and Jaffa, from surrounding countries under the impact of first of epidemics, and second, economic hardships, and later of an expanding economy promising jobs and business opportunities. There was also illegal immigration. As the political situation in Palestine worsened, however, Armenians began to leave the country. In 1947, some 1,500 refugees were repatriated to Soviet Armenia, inaugurating the decline of Palestine's Armenian population that gathered momentum with the 1948 war. Inevitably, the almost overnight demographic transformation of the community in the early 1920s caused strains. The indigenous Armenian referred to in the new context as locals, Karakatsis in Armenian. Karakatsi means local. Thoroughly Arabized and speaking a heavily accented Armenian, sharing the customs and the cuisine of Palestinian Arab society, suddenly found themselves vastly outnumbered by refugees, known as guests or zuwars. In Arabic, zuwar means guest, who knew no Arabic, spoke only Turkish and Armenian, and had different ways and traditions. The zuwar, who saw the Karakatsi as more Arab than Armenian, had brought with them their own political parties and pan-Armenian unions from the regions from which they were deported and were initially totally alien to the momentous political transformations underway in Palestine. Even as they came to realize that the stakes involved, they were naturally more preoccupied with rebuilding their lives and recovering from the tragedy that had befallen on them. Eventually, however, they were won over the locals' kindness and generosity, and a gradual process of integration began. When the British entered Jerusalem in 1917, they established a military administration whose immediate task was to deal with the famine, dislocations, and disruptions caused by the war. In July 1920, the military regime was replaced by the civil administration under a high commissioner, and on 29 September 1922, the Palestine Mandate was approved by League of Nations. Meanwhile, the Armenian Patriarchate had been in a deplorable state situation for over a decade. Besides the turmoil within the community resulting from the refugee influx, the Patriarchal See within the Patriarchal See had been vacant since 1910. In 1921, Yerishe Turian was elected Patriarch under the procedures established in the Constitution of the Brotherhood in 1888, except that the election was now confirmed by the British Crown rather than by the Sultan, and had been, as has been the case under Ottomans. Patriarch Turian faced monumental task of providing shelter for the refugees still pouring into the country, working with the Armenian General Benevolent Union and in Near East relief. The Patriarchate of St. James took in more than 800 male and female orphans from Deir ez-Zor, the desert, which was the final destination of the Armenians, where majority of them were killed. It was the Auschwitz of Armenians. And elsewhere in Syria, setting up mixed orphanages in St. James Cathedral, the Araradian Orphanage, the Holy Cross Convent, Greek Convent Orphanage, and the orphanage in Nazareth. He also played a major role in organizing the Armenian community of Haifa. And these are the images of the Armenian orphans, which include the grandmothers of my wife. They were orphans who came to Jerusalem and then build their own lives outside of Jerusalem. They went to Iraq, for example, and settled there. So again, many Armenians refer their ancestry, modern Armenians, to these orphans who lived in Jerusalem. And this is the orphanage in Jerusalem. This is the Vaspuragan orphanage in Jerusalem. And this is the Araradian orphanage in Jerusalem too. Pursuing his goal of raising the educational and cultural level of the community, Turian enacted a series of reforms aimed at improving conditions within the Brotherhood. In 1909, he initiated the building of the Gulbenkian Library, the largest library outside Armenia, and the Holy Translators TARKMATCHATS School, which I graduated from in the mid-90s. He also revived the Armenian press shut down during the war. So this is the Gulbenkian Library, built in 1929. It houses above 100,000 books relating to different topics on Armenian studies. And this is the school, St. TARKMATCHATS School, from which I graduated in the mid-90s. So the talk today is also about my history and my family history. Thus, Jerusalem emerged as one of the leading Armenian culture and religious centers in the Middle East. On July 20, 1930, Torkom Kushagian was elected as Patriarch after the death of Turian. His first task was to attend to the Patriarchate's considerable debts. Besides witnessing a dramatic decrease in the Patriarchate's debts between 1931 and 1936, he foresaw the growth of the Patriarchate's real estate holding, including properties in West Jerusalem. Kushagian died in 1939 and was followed by Mesrop Nishanian. Like his predecessors, he emphasized on education, and he was followed by Gurer Israelian, who was elected as Patriarch, and his tenure was marked by the rapidly deteriorating Palestinian political situation that culminated in the 1948 war, during which played a vital role in safeguarding the community, providing food and shelter during the hostilities. The Patriarchate seat remained vacant for almost a decade following his death in 1949. While the Armenians under the Mandate were far less involved in the political life of Palestine than they had been during the late Ottoman period, British rule witnessed a real flourishing of Armenian civil society organizations and institutions. Education was a high priority for both the Armenian ecclesiastic leadership and lay communities. The largest Armenian education institutions in Palestine was the above-mentioned Armenian school, founded by Turian, which offered courses in Armenian history, classical and modern Armenian, religion, science, mathematics, as well as English and Arabic. When I graduated from the school in the mid-90s, the school was teaching 5 languages, including classical Armenian. There were other schools also in Haifa, Jaffa, and also Armenian students in Palestine attended non-Armenian schools such as Bishop Gobat, St. George, the British schools, Anglican, Saint Joseph and Frere, these are the French schools, and the Schmidt, the German school near the Damascus Gate. Of course, if their families could afford the tuition and the fees. The Mandate period was especially notable for its immense proliferation of Armenian sports and cultural societies, especially in the 1930s. For the most part, club memberships were either Ka'akatsi, meaning locals, or Zawar. Rarely, they were mixed. The exact number of these clubs is unknown, above 15 maybe, but there were certainly scores. Most were in Jerusalem, but clubs existed everywhere in Palestine, where there were a significant Armenian population. Zawar clubs predominated. Some were based on members' hometowns in Anatolia, not only serving as gathering place based on members' hometowns in Anatolia, not only serving as gathering places, but also making possible the revival and the preservation of their traditions and localisms. Of these, some were Pan-Armenian unions with chapters elsewhere in the diaspora, such as the Marash Pan-Armenian Union. Marash is a city in Cilicia. And my grandfather, for example, used to visit the Marash Club, which is near the Armenian Quarter, near the today's police station towards the entrance in the Armenian Quarter. There were also political clubs, and it was not uncommon even for clubs devoted to sports and other activities to have memberships that were either Dashnak, the Armenian political party, or Ramgavar, different political party. For refugees arriving in a new and even somewhat alien place, the clubs played a particular vital role. A multiplicity of Armenian sports clubs, of which the most prominent was the Homentmen and the Hoyechmen clubs, distinguishing themselves in soccer, basketball, and boxing, competing not only against each other, but against Arab, British, and Jewish teams. Armenians were particularly strong in boxing, and even all Armenian matches were covered by the local press, specifically the Palestine Post. Among the outstanding Armenian boxers, the most famous was Mardo Goziguchukyan, otherwise known as Boxer Mardo, who won the title of the Near East heavyweight champion after defeating the Egyptian champion boxer Abdo Kubrit. Armenian cultural societies were also very visible, with active lecture programs and cultural events. Concerts and music recitals, sometimes held in the auditorium of the YMCA to accommodate large audiences, Armenian and non-Armenian alike, were also covered by the local press. It is not coincidental that most of the Armenian clubs and associations, the vast majority of which were Zawar, were founded in the 1930s. By that time, the refugees were no longer occupied solely with the matter of shelter and survival. Though initially destitute, most of them had professions, which became their tools of survival. Within a decade of their arrival, aided by gradual improvement of the economy, they had begun to engage in business and open their own small shops, already contributing to the local economy. They were particularly prominent as goldsmith, silversmith, shoemakers, tailors, tinsmith. They also worked in photography and ceramics. The following map is the map of the old city of Jerusalem, shows the spread of the Armenian businesses and shops during the Mandate period. Except for the shops in the Armenian section. So the blue color represents the Armenian businesses, okay? So except to the Armenian within the, except for the shops along the Armenian street within the Patriarchate, most of the Armenian businesses were in the Christian quarter, which is here. Oh, sorry. Okay, which is here, which is in the Christian quarter, what's today called as Hart al-Nasara, the Christian neighborhood. And more generally, the map also shows the Armenian presence in the old city. The dark orange, strong orange, represents the strong Armenian presence, those being the Armenian quarter and the Armenian Catholic Vicariate, which is the other major concentration. And the yellow color represents the Armenian presence, lighter presence in different parts of the old city of Jerusalem. While the overwhelming majority of Jerusalem's Armenian population under the Mandate lived inside the old city, during the 1930s, wealthy Armenians began to move outside the old city to what was then called the new city, mainly in Western Jerusalem. Starting in the late 19th century, new largely Arab and Greek mixed neighborhoods of elegant and spacious villas were built and soon became among the most desirable residential area of Jerusalem. As we know, after 1948, most of these were occupied by the Zionist forces. These Armenians, like the Arab, Muslim, and Christians who had moved there from the old city, were part of the developing bourgeoisie class. And this class affiliation to an extent trumped confessional differences or concerns. Thus, Armenians did not form an enclave, but were intermingled with the Arab Muslims and Christians scattered among the neighborhood, such as Bab al-Zahira, Sheikh Jarrah, Wadi Juz, Musrara, Mamilla, and Nabi Dawood, Bak'a, Upper and Lower, Talbiya, Katamun, the Greek and the German colonies. During the 1948 war, Armenians from all over Palestine converged on the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem's old city, testimony to what the Patriarchate represented for the community in terms of protection and security. Within the compound walls, they organized themselves. Meanwhile, an Armenian civil guard armed with makeshift weapons was formed to protect the quarter from the Haganah shelling of the old city. More than 40 Armenians died in the fighting, including my father's cousin, Untitled Der Matossian. The 1948 war brought to an end to an important period in Armenian history in Palestine. Major dislocations followed. The Armenian communities of Jaffa and Haifa and other areas that became Israel were reduced to insignificance. West Jerusalem, including the wealthy Arab neighborhood of the new city, where several hundred Armenians' families had lived, was occupied by the Israeli forces, and almost the entire non-Jewish population was expelled, losing their homes and businesses. The Armenian residents left the country entirely. Jerusalem's old city, with its Armenian quarter that for many centuries had been the heart of Palestine's Armenian community and a vital part of the city, remained in Arab Jordanian hands until 1967. But the community had already been dealt a mortal blow, and its dramatic decline was already underway. Now I'm going to discuss the Jordanian period. By the end of 1948 war, some Armenians in Palestine became refugees for a second time, fleeing the areas that were occupied by the newly established state of Israel. Around 3,000 were displaced. Refugees arrived in the St. James Convent at the Armenian quarter. Their property was confiscated by the Israeli government and was put under the control of the custodian of the abandoned properties. Eventually, most of them immigrated to Syria, Lebanon, Armenia, and west through Jordan. Despite this, a small number of Armenians stayed in Jaffa, Haifa, and Jerusalem, and Bethlehem, and Ramallah too. After the 1948 war, Jerusalem was divided between the Israelis and the Jordanians, who consecutively had a great say in the internal affairs of the Christian communities of Jerusalem. The Armenian community of Jerusalem was not immune to this interference. In the 2 decades following the war, the Armenian community was shaken by a bitter conflict pertaining to the election of a new patriarch. This struggle was not only ecclesiastic in nature, but involved most of the Armenians in Jerusalem who supported rival factions and clergymen. I'm not going to enter into details about what happened, but the Armenian Patriarchate faced another challenge after 1948, as I said, election. For 11 years, the position of the Patriarch remained vacant as a result of tension and rivalries between different religious leaders and factions in brotherhood and lay community over who should be the Patriarch. After long struggle, on 8 June 1960, Derderian was elected Patriarch, receiving votes out of 23. He was backed by the Jordanians. On 10 August, King Hussein of Jordan ratified his election, and he was enthroned as the Patriarch at an official ceremony in the Cathedral of St. James on 21st, 1960 of August. Derderian's victory should be attributed to his being a Jordanian citizen well acquainted with Jordanian political system and using it to his advantage. The first important task Derderian performed during the 3rd years of his tenure was presiding over the restoration of the Church of Holy Sepulchre in 1963. After the Six-Day War of 1967, now I'm discussing the Armenians under the Israeli rule, more Armenians from Jerusalem migrated to different parts of the world. The old city of Jerusalem came under the Israeli control, and the Patriarchate now resumed full control of its properties on the Israeli side. The war also led to the cutting of the ties between the Armenian communities of Jerusalem and the counterparts in Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan, causing serious damage to the shrinking community because there were a lot of intermarriages between Armenians of Jerusalem and other Armenians from Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan. And this led to kind of cutting the nerve of the vein of the Armenian community of Jerusalem. Most of the Armenians in the occupied territories retained their Jordanian citizenship, and the Armenians of East Jerusalem received the legal status of Israeli permanent resident. Despite the decline of the community, the remaining Armenians continued to pursue their businesses in the old city of Jerusalem. The majority of those who left were goldsmiths, photographers, and ceramicists. Much progress was made under the tenure of Patriarch Derderian. In 1975, the Alex and Mary MANOOGIAN Theological Seminary was inaugurated with the aim of making Jerusalem the center of providing priests to the Armenian diaspora community. This is the image of the Armenian seminary. It's a large seminary, and this is the memorial, the Ardanta of the memorial of the Armenian genocide victims. It used to be in the Armenian cemetery, but they moved it here. Despite these achievements, Derderian's tenure witnessed a second round of tensions and rivalries among clerical figures dealing with maladministration, embezzlement, selling lands to Israeli authorities without the consent of the Patriarch. These ecclesiastic tensions had also a tremendous impact on the Armenian community of Jerusalem. The deteriorating political situation within the occupied territories led to the First Intifada. It began, as we know, at the end of 1987 as a spontaneous eruption of frustration against Israeli occupation. After the rise of the right wing into power in Israel in 1977, the settlements policies within the occupied territories dramatically intensified. Aggressive land requisitions, coupled with intensification of administrative detention of Palestinians and the deteriorating economic situation in the occupied territories, led to protest movement. The Intifada, as we know, featured resistance, civil disobedience, boycotts of Israeli civil administration, general strikes, and widespread throwing of stones at the IDF soldiers. The grim economic and political situation in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Jerusalem had dramatic impact on the Armenian shopkeepers. Eventually, many of them immigrated to US, Canada, and Australia. This was not only confined to the Armenians of Jerusalem, it impacted entire Christian communities as well. one of the most significant demographic trends of the Christians in Jerusalem and the West Bank since the War of 1948 has been their perpetual decline. After the death of Derderian, MANOOGIAN became the patriarch in 96 patriarch by securing a wide range support. Both the Kingdom of Jordan and the Israeli government ratified his election. His task was to reform the internal situation of the patriarchate. But like his predecessor, he failed to deal with one of the most important factors for the decline of the Armenian community, the housing crisis. Jerusalem faces a tremendous housing crisis. It's not easy to buy houses in West Jerusalem. It's very expensive. And the Armenian Patriarchate has failed to provide appropriate housing to its members, leading them to feel frustrated and then leaving the country. Unlike what's happening with the Latin Patriarchate, who has been very active in building apartments, houses for their own community. Following MANOOGIAN's death, Patriarch Nurhan MANOOGIAN now became the the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. Now I'm going to talk about the Armenian Catholic community briefly. The founding of the Armenian Catholic Church in Jerusalem took place in the second half of the 19th century, when Jerusalem began gaining more religious, political, and economic importance internationally. In 1856, Patriarch Aspazadurian sent Reverend Serope Tavitian to Jerusalem on a mission to find suitable property for a church. The area where the third station on Via Dolorosa is now located was an empty lot, except for a building housing the Turkish bath called Hammam Sultan. Tavitian was interested in the lot because, according to tradition, a church once stood on the site. He was able to purchase it thanks to the generosity of an Armenian notable by the name of Andon Bey Mısırlian. Tavitian became the first patriarchal vicar. In 1872, he was replaced by Reverend Hovagim Tumanian. During the church construction, Tumanian discovered a mosaic pavement depicting a pair of sandals in its center, which was thought to represent the spot in which Jesus met his mother. Hence, a small chapel was erected, becoming the fourth station on Via Dolorosa Street. The construction of the vicariate ended in 1885, whereas the church was completed in 1905. Like its Gregorian patriarchal counterpart, the Armenian Catholic vicariate had remained vacant during the turmoil of World War I. It was filled only in 1921 when Reverend Momjan, formerly Dean of the Livonian School in Rome, arrived in Jerusalem. As head of the community from 1921-1930, he oversaw the resettlement of the Armenian Catholic refugees and renovation of the Armenian Catholic Church. A community center was created to meet the spiritual, material, and cultural needs of the refugees due to the fact that the Armenian Patriarchate was not able to accommodate all the refugees. In addition, a cultural association was formed by the Armenian Catholic intellectuals who began spreading the Armenian language and culture among the Turkish-speaking refugees, most of whom arrived from Cilicia. The successor of Momjan, Hagop Giragosyan, played a dominant role in rebuilding the Armenian infrastructure of Armenian Catholic community. Like religious Christian counterparts, the vicar became the representative of the Armenian Catholic community in front of the British administration. Known as the Reformer, Giragosyan undertook the modernization of buildings and the installation of electricity and running water within the convent. He also opened a school run by the Armenian Sisters, Congregation of the Immaculate Conception. Giragosyan also created sports and culture association, Scouts Group, most important of which was the Arax Club, which was established in 1935. Despite being much smaller in number, the members of the Armenian community, like other Orthodox counterpart, their Orthodox counterpart, established themselves as jewelers, craftsmen, pharmacists, teachers, and owners of businesses. In 1930s and 40s, their situation began to improve. However, their number began to decline as a result of the 1948 war. Under the Jordanian rule, their situation was somewhat stable. The relationship between the Armenian Orthodox and the Armenian Catholic churches and communities was cordial. This was due to their common national and cultural heritage, especially given that both groups included a large population who survived the Armenian genocide. During the tenure of Gamsaragan, who followed Momjan, the condition of the Armenian Catholic community generally improved. In the 1980s and 1990s, the community began to decline as the vicariate suffered from internal schisms, mismanagement of finances, and maladministration by lay community members. This trend had started in the aftermath of the 1967 war, when many Armenian Catholic families immigrated. The arrival in 2002 of Most Reverend Kevor Khazumian raised some optimism, which was dashed with his sudden departure in 2006. Today, fewer than 50 Armenian Catholic families, numbering a couple of hundred non-members, are left in Jerusalem. Once a vibrant community, it is today struggling to keep its church and identity alive. Before concluding, I would like to discuss another point, which is after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a large immigration of Russian Jewry into Israel. Of course, this was aimed to counter the demographic rise of Palestinian population. There were a lot of Armenians who came with this wave. Of course, all of us know that maybe more than half or quarter of those who came into Israel were not actually Jews. They're Christians. And many of them were Armenians. So thousands who came today to Israel came from the post-Soviet republics and Armenia. And they've created a community in the city of Petah Tikva near Tel Aviv, and also Tel Aviv. And so there are thousands of them who do not have that much of close contact with the Armenian Patriarch in Jerusalem, but they feel Armenian, they have Armenian identity, and they are Armenians. In conclusion, the history of Armenians of Palestine, Israel is that of the perseverance and uncertainty in the face of many crises spanning their existence in the Holy City from the 4th century until today. For the most part, the modern community was shaped by the influx of survivors of the Armenian genocide. The ecclesiastic leaders who witnessed the genocide arrived in Jerusalem and undertook the task of alleviating the hardships of their fellow refugees. This influx rejuvenated the old community and created a new identity, the Jerusalemite identity, allowing it to play an important role in the economic and social life of the city during the British Mandate and the Jordanian periods. Despite efforts to remain insular and detach themselves from the political upheavals taking place around them, the Armenians of Jerusalem were at times dragged into the political climate of Palestine, the region, and the Cold War politics. These conflicts left their marks on the community. Hence, one of the major factors that led to the decline was the Arab-Israeli conflict. After the 1967 war, the Armenians of Jerusalem fell under the jurisdiction of the Jerusalem branch of Israeli Ministry of Interior Affairs. They suffered the same fate as the other Palestinians in Jerusalem in terms of Israeli discriminatory laws. Eventually, many families began to immigrate to the West seeking a better life and more freedom. As a result, and until today, the Patriarchate lacked a comprehensive vision to sustain the Armenian community in the face of these external and internal crises. Today, the shrinking Armenian community numbers in Jerusalem around 1,000 and is at the verge of demise, leaving many of its members hoping for drastic reforms that might prevent its collapse. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Der Matossian, for that rich, informative, and interesting presentation. We appreciate it. At this time, we will open the floor for questions. You may type in your questions in the Q&A. If you have a laptop, if you move your cursor, you'll probably see it at the bottom. If you're on a phone, you may have to look around a little bit to find the Q&A. And we already have a couple of questions from my colleague, Professor Mark Bernstein. Would it be possible to provide some general outline of the Armenian genocide and the influx of refugees into Jerusalem, also the Millet system?
Of course, the Armenian genocide wasn't the first genocide, it was the second genocide of the 20th century, because the first genocide was the genocide of the Herero. It was perpetrated by the CUP in order to solve the Armenian question, memories of which are haunting today the Armenian vulnerable population of Nagorno-Karabakh as a result of the war. Again, there are a lot of commonalities between what happened in the past and what's happening today with the Azeri-Turkish invasion on Artsakh. But to make it brief, Armenian genocide attempted to solve the Armenian question, which was lingering in the Ottoman Empire, by taking a drastic measure during World War I of eliminating the Armenian population of Anatolia, of Western Armenia. They were successful in eliminating, but many were able to survive the genocide through whether they were able to survive the caravans. Mostly 10% to 5% of caravans that were deported from their motherlands were able to survive. Many refugees ended in Aleppo, Lebanon, but a lot of them came to Jerusalem. It was part of the Near East Relief Project, part of the Armenian General Benevolent Union project. It's also due to the centrality of Jerusalem for the Armenian nation. That's the short answer. The Millet system was a system that was used by the Ottoman Empire, which provided autonomy to the non-Muslim elements within the Ottoman Empire, cultural autonomy, legal autonomy, and they were, and as such, the Ottoman Empire survived the kind of quote-unquote coexistence. But the Millet system was problematic due to the fact that the leader was the Patriarch, the head was the Patriarch, and the Ottomans preferred to deal with religion than with national identity. And of course, in the 19th century, where reform movement started in the Ottoman Empire, and the Tanzimat reform started, the Millet system began to be reformed. An Armenian national constitution was ratified in 1863, whereby there would be major secular representation in the decision-making process. And the idea of getting rid of the Millet system was also to create a common Ottoman identity, that everyone would be equal Ottoman citizens. And that was the aim, which didn't succeed. So when the British came, they went back to the old Millet system, the unreformed Millet system, in order to rule. Their idea, as all of us know, the British mandate emphasized on religious loyalties than national loyalties. It's the classic divide and conquer rule.
We have a follow-up question from Professor Bernstein. Has the shared experience of genocide not facilitated some sort of rapprochement between Israeli Jews and Armenians? Other than the housing crisis, what other factors have led to, actually it's a series of questions. Maybe I'll leave that question up there and then we can go to the next, and unless we see other questions as well, I'll turn it over to you, Professor.
Yes, I'm referring to the huge wave of millions arriving in the 90s. And there might be also workers coming from there.
Yeah, so I think I hear Professor Der Matossian is referring to the end of the question, which is that.
Oh, there is another question. Okay, sorry, yes. I'll read it.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. So I was just asking the first part about the experience of genocide, if it facilitated some sort of rapprochement between Israeli Jews and Armenians.
No, actually, no. It didn't create any rapprochement. As a matter of fact, the latest aid that, I mean, this is well known now. A country like Israel, who went through Holocaust, has aided authoritarian countries like Azerbaijan with the latest drones, UAVs, in order to kill Armenians in the region of Nagorno-Karabakh. There are few Israeli scholars who side with Armenians, but the government policy under Netanyahu and under previous governments is that first of all, they deny the genocide. Their interests are with Turkey and Azerbaijan, and there's no recognition of the Armenian genocide. So these are important policies that we have to discuss. And the latest move that the Israeli government took by allowing Israeli military companies such as Rafael to sell weapons to a perpetrator group, which led to major catastrophic results that we are facing repercussions today. 61% of the Azerbaijan's weapons come from Israel. And there has been a lot of lobbying within Israel, within the Armenian community, Jewish community, to prevent this happening. But realpolitik, or self-interest, triumphed morality. This would remain black stain on Israel for the years and decades to come.
Yeah, we do have other questions, but I do see also a new person asking a question here. This is my colleague, Professor Shwarnaval Eshwaran Pillai. He says, thanks for your insightful presentation. Is there support for the Armenians in their present struggle from within Jerusalem?
Support, I mean, in what sense support?
Yeah, it's not clear. Maybe, Shwarnaval, if you'd like to elaborate.
I'm just going to discuss about the other housing crisis. Yes. What other factors have led the decline of the Armenian community, Bernstein? It's discrimination, I would say, discrimination of Armenians too. I mean, from the Israeli perspective, the other is the other, whether it's Arab or Armenian, they're all Palestinians for them. Whether you have Israeli citizenship or not, again, you're not part of the society. And more Israel is going to the right-wing part of right-wing inclination, and that has also been left a major impact on the Armenian community. Of course, the situation might be much better for the Armenians of Tel Aviv, Jaffa, or Haifa, but Jerusalem has been under major pressure.
Thank you for that. While we wait for the elaboration, there is another question from, actually we have a bunch of questions all of a sudden. Okay, so actually going back to Professor Pillai, clarification. So the question was, is there support for the Armenians in their present struggle from within Jerusalem? And the clarification is in terms of material, press, and media, and the church. Thank you for that.
Well, they are trying to do everything. I mean, whoever left is there. There are today trying to do everything in their power. But again, the Patriarchate owns large tracts of lands, and it is in their interest to have to, in order to sustain the community, have to provide housing or build apartment buildings or buildings to house the community. We're not seeing this happening, unlike the case of the Latin Patriarchate. I mean, the most successful case is the Latin Patriarchate, the Catholic Patriarchate, who has been on the forefront, maybe because they're backed by the Vatican, has been in the front in providing aid to their own constituencies, building houses in the region of Bet Hanina, in Jerusalem and other places. And we don't see this happening in the case of the Armenian Patriarchate.
Thank you for that. We do have time for one more question, and here is a question from Grayson Dwyer. Regarding the housing crisis, how has the Latin Patriarchy succeeded where the Armenian Patriarchy has failed?
Again, I mean, It's the weakness of the Armenian Patriarchate. It's the weakness, lack of vision, but also the Latin Patriarchate is backed by 1.3 billion people, Catholics, okay? And by the Vatican. So that's their strength, that's coming from their strength. Another thing that is interesting is that the Latin Patriarchate has a method of rotation. I think every 2 years a new priest comes, and it's a rotation. They go to different parts, Brazil and other places. Whereas the Armenian Jerusalem does not have a rotating priest due to its number. So it creates sometimes a lot of problems in the sense if someone is sitting on the real estate and for many years he starts doing illegal deals with selling lands to Israeli government, to Israeli business representatives. So, and as a matter of fact, after 1967, this illegal selling of lands has plagued the Armenian community in Jerusalem. One priest or a bishop might jump up and say, "I'm going to sell this," and then make millions of dollars and boom, escape from there. And this is not only in the Armenian case. The Greek Patriarchate suffers from the similar situation.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I thought it was patriarchate, not patriarchy. Yeah, thank you for that clarification. And then we have a bunch of thank yous here. Professor Mark Bernstein, thank you for your enlightening presentation and your critical perspective on the decline of the community. May there be positive changes for the community's welfare in the future. Professor Pelias says, thank you, Professor. And Professor Tamar Boyadjian, who proposed this event, thank you for an incredible presentation and for bringing such great awareness to this history. On behalf of the Muslim Studies program and all of the co-sponsors, we thank you for taking time to be with us. It's too bad we couldn't be with you in person, but this is the next best thing, I guess. So thank you so much for taking time to be with us in your presentation. And this presentation was recorded, and we will be posting it online as well. So
thank you very much.
And thanks to all of you who attended. Thank you so much.